The Krampus, written by Caitlin Wilkinson, narrated by Zach Federici, featuring Stu Ford as Decius. Prologue. 28 years before Everworld's decimation. The glowing red sleigh shot through the sky. The leftern side of the sleigh's enchanted wood had been burned away to reveal the blackened skeleton beneath. The sleigh's enchantments were failing rapidly, and its trajectory lowered as it hurtled towards a snowy clearing. The glowing runes etched into the sleigh caught on fire as they became overwhelmed by damage sustained from the burnt-out enchantments. Helvian elves screamed in terror, their bony hands grasping around whatever they thought most sturdy as the ground drew closer. The heavily cloaked figure sat still on the sleigh's forward bench, his face hidden beneath his thick white beard and the shadow cast by his long hood. The sleigh impacted the ground, the snow beneath it evaporating as a monstrous moan erupted from the sled. The heavily cloaked figure stood, climbing from the sled as the surviving elves moaned and scurried about beneath him. The burnt ground beneath his hooves felt solid, and even hunched, he stood taller than the 8-foot-tall snow that surrounded the sled's crash point. He turned, surveying the sled as the elves beat out the fire. The demonic dragon skeleton had been partially revealed, but appeared undamaged. That couldn't be said for the rest of his sleigh. A rasp emitted from his mouth, and one of the elves scurried over to stand before him. This Helvian elf was slightly taller than his fellows. He stood 4 feet, his deformed brown head barely reaching his master's waist. Red irises shone from his beady black eyes as he looked up and spoke in a gravelly, yet slightly high-pitched tone.
The sled is heavily damaged. We can repair its exterior with what we salvaged. But we will need to create a Zizlorg ritual if we wish to repair, reinfuse, and rebuild the enchantments.
The figure reached past the elf and into the sleigh, his 6 long claws extending from his thick, woolly sleeve and grasping around the red sack which he pulled up and slung over his shoulder, before jumping out of the crater formed by the sled's impact. His hooves glowed a faint blue as they landed on the snow, sinking mere inches rather than feet as the massive Krampus began walking toward the humans he could sense some dozen miles away. The surviving elves remained behind, healing their injuries and working to repair their sled. The Krampus could summon them to himself, should he need to, a prospect which they both feared and eagerly anticipated. The Krampus was the master they'd chosen to serve, and their fates were linked to his. He had sensed a demonic gathering some days ago, and so had steered their sled toward it. They'd arrived at the site of the gathering only to find that a portal to the infernal plane had been opened. Armies of demons, undead, humans, and yetis fought around the portal, and their master had forced them to join in the fray in an attempt to reach the portal. But the fighting had gone poorly for them, and a lich had injured their master, forcing them to flee in the sled, which had been damaged in the conflict, and further impaired by a parting spell from the lich. A sudden rattling from a box caused the lead elf, Sylvis, the tallest and smartest among them, to turn. He quickly clamped a hand over the lid, mana flowing from him, empowering the box's enchantments and causing the rattling to cease. He surveyed the other parcels littered about the sled, ensuring that they were secure, before returning to his work. Snow fell, landing atop the horns which protruded from the holes in Krampus's hood. He walked hunched, the sound of the elves' work growing further and further behind him. He was the Krampus, but his name was also Krampus, which was the reason why his race was now labeled Krampus. His breath caused steam to emit from his long, dark hood. He didn't require air to live, though he continued to breathe. He did many things which others might have seen as unnecessary. Such was his nature. Such was his purpose. Layers and layers of clothing covered him. Some were a part of him to the point that he no longer knew where the cloaks ended and where his flesh began. Some were enchanted, some were not. He held items within them. Sacred items, which were to be produced only when necessary. Items which were a part of him. Extensions of himself, which he'd collected over the long years. His nose sniffed in a long breath as he smelled the humans which he'd sensed. 3 of them, and they were with animals too. A town must lay nearby, a town which he would have to visit to spread his tidings and repair his sled.